Why would a billionaire put 98% of his wealth into gold and silver? I mean, seriously, not 10%, not 20%, not even 50%. We're talking 98%. People will say, that's crazy, it's reckless, that's fear-based investing. And honestly, part of me agrees with some of that, because as someone who's personally invested in these before, I can tell you firsthand, these markets can be brutal. So when I read that billionaire investor Eric Sprott, 81 years old, has roughly 98% of his wealth tied to gold and silver, it made me stop and wonder. Because whether you agree with them or not, you have to ask yourself, what does somebody like him see coming? What does he believe about the financial system, about debt, about currencies, about governments printing endless money that would make him bet almost everything on one single sector? Throughout history, some of the biggest fortunes were made by people who looked crazy before everyone else understood what was really happening. And for others, they could be completely wiped out when obsessed with a single idea. So today, I want to explore both sides of this, not as a gold and silver promoter, not as some doom and gloom YouTuber, but as a level-headed accountant who's also a casual investor, and honestly, just somebody trying to make sense of what's happening in the world right now. By the way, my name's Noel Lorenzana. Welcome back to my channel. Please do me a favor and give the video a like, subscribe to stay connected, and none of this is financial or investment advice. The big bet. So who exactly is Eric Sprott? Well, he's not some random guy on the internet yelling about the collapse of the dollar from his mom's basement. He's a billionaire investor, and over the past few decades, he's become one of the biggest names in the gold and silver space. According to a recent article, Sprott says roughly 98% of his wealth is tied to gold and silver investments. And here's the part that's really noteworthy. He says those investments have grown about 4 times in just 2 years. Now, obviously, when something goes up that much, it becomes easy for people to say, see, he was right all along. But I think we should slow down for a second, because concentrated investing cuts both ways. When you're right, you can experience unbelievable gains, but when you're wrong, it can wipe you out. And history is filled with examples of both. There were people who looked absolutely brilliant during the dot-com bubble until they didn't. There were people who looked unstoppable during the housing bubble until the music stopped. And honestly, that's why this story interests me so much, because what Sprott is doing is not normal diversification. This is conviction, extreme conviction. This is somebody effectively saying, I trust gold and silver more than I trust the financial system. And whether you think that's smart, paranoid, senility, or somewhere in between, that's a bold statement. Now, to be fair to him, his argument is actually pretty simple. He believes governments around the world have become addicted to debt and money printing. The United States, Canada, Europe, Japan, take your pick. Governments continue spending enormous amounts of money, running deficits, and piling debt on top of debt. And eventually, people start asking real questions like, how long can this go on for? Can governments really borrow trillions of dollars indefinitely with no consequences? And if they can't, what happens to the value of our paper money? That's really the core of the gold argument. Gold fanatics will tell you, you can print dollars, but you can't print gold. Now, personally, I think there's truth to that, but I also think people can become emotionally consumed by these narratives, and that's where things can get dangerous, because investing based purely on fear or economic collapse, that can be very unhealthy financially speaking. And I've seen it happen. Some people have been predicting the end of the dollar for 30 or 40 years. And meanwhile, the stock market kept going up, technology kept advancing, and life kept moving forward. So I think it's important to stay balanced here. But at the same time, I also understand why more people are paying attention to gold and silver right now, because some of the numbers honestly are getting hard to ignore. And when you combine massive government debt, never-ending deficits, central bank gold buying, geopolitical tensions, currency concerns, and weakening trust in institutions, you start understanding why somebody like Eric Sprott believes what he believes. Interestingly enough, Eric Sprott isn't the only major investor worried about these issues anymore. When smart people start getting nervous. And this is where the story starts getting harder to ignore, because Eric Sprott isn't alone. You also have people like Ray Dalio talking about many of these exact same concerns. Now, if you don't know who Ray Dalio is, he founded a company called Bridgewater Associates, one of the largest hedge funds in the world. This is somebody who spent decades studying debt cycles, currencies, the rise and fall of empires, and financial history. And recently, Dalio has been warning about the same government debt problem. Basically, governments around the world have accumulated so much debt that eventually they run into a problem, a math problem, because the debt keeps compounding, interest expense keeps growing, and eventually governments are left with some very unpleasant choices. Raise taxes, cut spending, maybe default, or quietly devalue the currency over time. And historically, a lot of governments choose the last option because inflation is politically easier than outright collapse. It happens slowly. Your groceries cost more, insurance costs, housing costs, healthcare, they all cost more. And slowly people realize, wait, why can't I keep up with my bills any longer? Now, here's where Dalio differs from Sprott. Dalio isn't saying to put 98% of your wealth into gold. He's talking about something closer to 10 to 15% as a reasonable allocation depending on your situation. That's a huge difference. And honestly, that's probably where most normal people should stop and think, because there's a difference between portfolio insurance and making an all-in bet. Those are two very different mindsets. One says, I want some protection. The other says, I believe the entire system is fundamentally broken. And personally, I think that distinction matters a lot. And it's not just Eric Sprott or Ray Dalio anymore. Legendary investor Jim Rogers has also been sounding alarms about debt, money printing, and the long-term stability of the financial system. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Jim Rogers, he co-founded a company called the Quantum Fund with George Soros and became one of the most well-known commodity investors in the world. And recently, Rogers said he had sold off all of his US stocks because of concerns around America's debt levels. He's also said that gold and silver should be owned as long-term protection against government's enormous money printing. Now, whether he ultimately turns out to be right or wrong, the bigger point is this. More sophisticated investors are beginning to openly question whether the current system is sustainable long-term. And I think that's what makes this conversation so interesting. But even beyond billionaires, there's another thing happening right now that's very interesting. Central banks themselves have been buying enormous amounts of gold. Now, think about that for a second. The same institutions that oversee fiat or by agreement currency systems are aggressively accumulating gold. That alone should at least make people curious, because central banks clearly still view gold as strategic money, not as a barbarous relic, not as just some shiny rock. And I think this is where the average person starts to feel confused. Because on the one hand, they're told everything's fine, the economy's strong, inflation is under control. But on the other hand, they see governments drowning in debt. They see housing becoming unaffordable for many. They see prices rising everywhere. And now they're seeing billionaires and central banks loading up on gold. So naturally, people start wondering, wait a minute, what's really going on here? Is this really about gold and silver? Or distrust in the system? And honestly, the more I thought about the story, the more I realized this may not really be a gold and silver story at all. I think it's a trust story. Because at the end of the day, gold and silver don't earn anything. They don't generate cash flow. They just sit there. So why do people run to it? Usually because they're losing confidence in governments, in currencies, in central banks. That's usually the real driver. And history is filled with examples of this. During periods of high inflation, currency instability, war, banking crises, or sovereign debt problems, people tend to gravitate toward hard assets because hard assets are perceived as stable, or at least more stable than paper promises. Now, does that mean the dollar is about to collapse tomorrow? No. And personally, I think some people online go way too far with this stuff, including myself sometimes. The US dollar is still incredibly powerful. It's still the world's reserve currency. Most global trade still runs through dollars. And despite all the problems, people around the world still generally want dollars during periods of crisis. That matters a lot. One thing I've learned over the years is this. Markets often sense problems before the public fully understands them. And sometimes, certain investors become obsessed with themes long before anybody else notices. Now, sometimes they're completely wrong, but sometimes they're just early. The reality, though, is the US government has unsustainable debt levels approaching $40 trillion. Bond markets are breaking with yields at record levels, which makes new government debt even more expensive, and also the interest they have to pay on the debt. Now, let me ask you, how concerned are you? Let me know down below in the comments. The part most people don't want to hear. And honestly, there's another reason this story resonates with people right now. A lot of people simply don't trust the system anymore. At least not entirely. Maybe they still participate in it. Maybe they still invest in stocks. Maybe they still believe America will ultimately be okay. But something feels very different now. People feel it. They feel it when groceries cost twice as much as what they used to. They feel it when young families they know can't afford homes. They feel it when insurance, property taxes, healthcare, and basic living expenses keep climbing faster than their wages. And they especially feel it when they see ever more government spending while the national debt keeps exploding higher. And I think that's really the emotional core here behind the growing interest in gold and silver. It's not really about becoming rich overnight. For many, it's about protection. Protection against uncertainty, inflation, instability. Now, personally, I don't think putting 98% of your wealth into any single sector is appropriate for most anyone, because concentration cuts both ways. But do know this, when billionaire investors, central banks, and ordinary people all start worrying about the same thing at the same time, I think it's worth paying attention to. You know, the older I get, the more I realize that investing is really just a reflection of how people see the future. Eric Sprott clearly sees a world where hard assets become increasingly important. A world where governments continue printing money, debt continues rising, and confidence in fiat currency slowly erodes over time. But I also think it's important to remember this. The world rarely unfolds in a perfectly clean narrative. Sometimes the doomers are too pessimistic. Sometimes the optimists are too overconfident. And usually reality ends up somewhere in the messy middle. Kind of like life, really. Personally, I think gold and silver probably do deserve more attention that they've been getting from traditional investors over the last few decades. But 98%, that's a whole nother level. But understand this. When somebody worth billions of dollars puts nearly all of his money on one side of the table, it's probably worth asking why, even if you disagree with them. Anyway, that's my take. Agree, disagree, let me know what you think in the comments. And if you found value in the video and want to help me keep making videos like this one, and only if you have the means, I'd be incredibly grateful if you considered supporting the channel through a membership or over on Patreon. Links down below in the description. And if you ever wanted to know if you could sell gold and silver without the IRS knowing, then you need to check out my video right up here. And as always, thanks for watching and see you in the next video.